So Mark Levine is an elected official, but he's not elected citywide, but I will take that, that's good. I'm not exactly sure what's meant by the city manager. So there is something called the comptroller, and there is something called the public advocate. I don't know if you've heard of either of those, but this is sort of a quick overview. So the mayor is kind of the CEO of the city, right? And that is Eric Adams. He sets the agenda. He does a lot with the budget. He heads the city's agencies. So he is the head of the city's executive branch. And then there's the public advocate. So that's Jamani Williams. And he's basically like the people's advocate. So issues of complaints with the city's agencies not working as they should, not addressing correctly the issues, disputes between city agencies and its citizens, any kind of issue where the public needs someone to interact with the city and specifically the executive branch for not following the rules. That is the public advocate's job. It's actually kind of a new position. It wasn't, there's been, I think, 5 public advocates in recent years. The former one was the now current Attorney General for New York State, Tish James. And then there is the comptroller. That is Brad Lander. And he is basically the chief financial officer for the city. He oversees that the city disperses its budgets correctly, that the city's agencies use its money correctly. He oversees if projects are being done efficiently and effectively, that there is not excess waste. And he has a pretty big office and he has a decent amount of power. And these are the 3 people we elect citywide. On to the next. So, So non-citywide elected officials, and someone mentioned Mark Levine, so that's kind of off to a good start, right? So do you know how many non-citywide elected officials we have? I'm gonna take a guess. Just throw a number out there. Let's see if we're in the ballpark. One guess. Someone take a total number. Guess. You can put it in the chat if you want. Okay, no one? Okay, so there are, now we dealt with the executive branch. Mayor Adams heads the executive branch. Then there is the legislative branch. So we have 51 members of our city council. We don't actually have, kind of like if you think about federal, we don't have a Senate and a Congress. We have just the city council as one organization, one entity. And someone mentioned Mark Levine. He is the Manhattan borough president, which means there's got to be at least how many more borough presidents? How many boroughs do we have? How many boroughs are in New York City? Does anyone know the total? 5, exactly. So if Mark Levine is the Manhattan, we do the quick math, we have 4 more borough presidents. So we have 56 non-citywide elected officials, plus the 3 citywide officials. So we have 59 total that come up in elections. I forgot to mention, I think the public advocate actually is who would succeed the mayor, or he's the first in line, I believe I wrote it down. So here's our 51 member city council. They're not all in that picture. I actually couldn't find a picture with all of them. And here are the borough presidents. So Mark Levine is Manhattan. Does anyone recognize anyone else in these pictures? Any names of any of the others? Sorry, I gotta watch the chat too. I have like multiple things open. So, anyone? Sorry, I just want to look one thing up. Yeah, I was like, her name is Vanessa Gibson. I just wanted to make sure. She is the Bronx Borough President. So I'm going left to right. Antonio Reynoso is the Brooklyn Borough President. Donovan Richards, excuse me, is the Queens Borough President, and Vito Fossella is the Staten Island Borough President. And if you look him up, you might expect he's an interesting guy, the last one. So the borough presidents used to have a lot more power than they currently do. They used to have a bigger say in the budget. There was actually a ruling that went to the Supreme Court saying that they couldn't have that kind of power. We'll talk about that more if you're interested. And now they're sort of a little more, they kind of represent their boroughs. They have a kind of a bully pulpit, as you might say. They can introduce legislation, but they can't vote on it. The biggest role of the borough president is that they have a say in land use. And in New York City, one of the most controversial and important issues is every inch of land and who gets to say and do what with it. So in that sense, they have some efforts, but they are not, they are nowhere near as important as the mayor. So do you know anything, like we had an election in 2021, it was a very, very big election. And it was because term limits had come into effect for the first time in New York City. So the city council took a deal to raise their salaries and agree to term limits. And 41 out of the city's 59 elected positions were on the ballot. So it was like the epic elections is what the Washington Post called it. Two other interesting things out of 2021 was what we had for the first time. There was a change to the rules. We had ranked choice voting. And the other thing we had was public matching funds. So small, they were trying to encourage small donations. They were trying to encourage a more diverse candidate base. They were trying to lower the entry point for how much money and resources you had to come in and run. And they were quite successful at that. So the current city council, out of its 51 members, 31 are women. And there's never been a majority female city council. A lot of that was due to these changes and organizations to bring people from more diverse backgrounds to the city. Normally, the city council elects every 4 years. So why are we electing in 2023? Does anyone know? Any ideas? Oh, good. Someone knew Reno Stone Richards. Very good. Sorry, I'm just getting to the chat. I feel like I'm manning multiple screens. Does anyone know what happened? So, you know, try to give you an easy hand, right? Everyone's mad at New York because of control of Congress. New York really effed it up. But we redistrict. So this was a huge process to take the 2020 census, and now we have to change the districts in order to meet the current population. And so that process triggers a change in the council district boundaries, not in the mayor, not in the public advocate, not in the comptroller, because the city's boundaries haven't changed. So now we have a 2-year election, another 2-year election in 2025, and then they will go back to 4-year cycles. So this is not going to be a particularly interesting election. Most of the seats are decided, most of them will run uncontested. But if you do want to get involved, even if you just want to be a poll worker, the primary will happen June 27, 2023. I don't know when you actually have to register. It's usually a few weeks ahead is the last date for registration. And the general election will be on November 7th, 2023. The council will be there. So the ranked choice voting, again, is only used in the primary. Only a few seats are competitive. The district attorneys will also be on the ballot for Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. The district attorneys are actually not elected at the city level. They're elected at the county level. So they're statewide positions effectively. The civil court, delegates to the judicial convention, and party positions will all be on the ballot. So why don't we elect on the same year as the president? There was an original idea that if we elected off years, we could increase voter turnout. Turns out it was a horrible idea. People don't really come out to vote unless there's someone very big on the ballot. And there's been talk, at least one of the biggest things we could do to increase voter turnout would be to change this to match the congressional and presidential cycle. Yeah, so the 2021 elections, the primaries had very large turnout relative, and it was 26.5%. And the general election fell to a low of 23.3%. That said, the primaries really are the election in New York City. Most people are Democrats, or most of the big races are Democratic. So once the Democrat is decided for the primary, people lose momentum because the Republican isn't really going to win. Whether we have a Republican technically as mayor is a conversation we could have offline. And the courts, I can tell you a little bit about them, but we would need an expert. That's a whole nother world that is complicated and I don't really understand. So New York City, if there's an org chart, it's not that easy to follow. So here's kind of I cut it into 2 pieces to show it to you on 2 slides, but you can see a little bit, right? Like borough presidents don't exist anywhere else in the world. They're a unique role and you have to kind of fit them into this org chart. There's an independent budget office. I'm not going to have time to talk about that. There's the comptroller, public advocate, the city council. So they sort of all interplay. The chart's a little confusing. I don't know that I can draw a better version of it. This is the city's official. And you can see that a lot of these people really directly answer to the citizens of New York, not to the mayor, right? He's sort of like the president. The president doesn't oversee Congress. There's kind of some similar analogies. Not necessarily everything matches. The thing that's not, I'm going to say interesting, even when you ask people who are very well versed in the federal government, they often don't know that much. We don't get taught about the city government in schools. I think there's been some push to do it, Civics for All. I know I was not taught it as a public school kid, or if I was taught it, I forgot about it. And even at high levels, people don't really know a ton about it, even people who study it in political science. So it's a bit of a like scavenger hunt. You kind of find pieces of information, you have to piece it together, and you kind of have to depend on the kindness of strangers who, when I said to someone about the DAs, he used to work in the DA's office, or I was like, do the DAs answer to the New York Attorney General just like the federal government? And he's like, no, it doesn't quite work that way in New York City. So anyway, moving on, right? This is the bottom half of the org chart, and these are the city agencies. So it's kind of like the federal government. You'll find sanitation in there, you'll find FDNY in there, NYPD, and then a bunch of mayor's offices, the mayor's communications staff. But these are all of the infrastructure for the mayor. I don't know if there's that much more to say about this, but you can go online and find it and look it up if you're interested. So I don't know, sometimes I think when you walk down the street in New York City, it seems lawless, right? If you go to Penn Station, I once asked someone, I'm like, who runs Penn Station? No one knows, right? If you had a complaint, would you call MTA? Would you, the subways are part of Penn Station? Who runs all of this? And on a quick note, right, if you go back just out of, MTA is actually not a city agency. MTA is run by the state. So if you're annoyed, most people want to yell at the city when the subways don't work, but the city does not oversee the subways directly. So you just might want to know who to call when you're annoyed. But there are rules, just like there are federal rules, there's a code of federal regulations. New York City has a charter, you can go and read it. I work with someone in the city and she was very funny. She's like, I wouldn't have taken this job had I read the charter because what I want to do technically isn't allowed. But that was after she worked there for a little bit. So you can, the city revises the charter, the ranked choice voting, all of that stuff was revised recently. You can go back through the history and you can see how the charter has been revised in time. Part of it was taking some power away from the borough presidents as part of the Supreme Court, but the rules are here, whether people follow them or not, you know, who's to say, but you can go look them up and they're publicly accessible. How do you know things about New York? Where are the boundaries, right? So there's an organization called Beta NYC who helps post and maintain data related to New York City's open data law. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but basically there are requirements for New York City to post its data. And one of the things they have done, which is very nice and incredibly helpful, is created a boundaries map. So if you want to look up who your council member is, what community board district you're in, and what fire district, what school district, they're all different boundaries. You can go and click and look it up. You can also find your Congress people, your assembly districts, all of that really important stuff that you should know if you want to engage with policy in New York. And the link is here, but if you just type in like Beta NYC boundaries map, you should be able to come up with it and interact with it. So I'll talk a little bit more about it, but one of the important boundaries is a community board district. New York City has 59 community board districts, and there are at least 2 community board districts in each council district. So this is like the really grassroots point of engagement. This is where local representatives and people and citizens, this is the place and the forum for them to get involved. They can be complicated places to interact in. There is still politics, but many people get their start in government through the community boards. They post meetings. There's a whole page on New York City government about when their next meetings are. You can be appointed to your community board. Borough presidents make the final decisions on those things. They can be contentious places. I was just reading an article lately, right? There's certain issues, like someone was like, I've seen it come to blows over bikes and cars, who's going to get this space on the street. And then, there are many other things they do. I've spoken to Community Board 5 in Manhattan. So after Hurricane Ida, they wanted some ideas about how they should be approaching climate change and just other actions that they could take. So there are opportunities to speak to them, but usually you kind of have to know someone. I don't know if they'll normally reach out to you. The other thing you should know, you want to get involved with policy, is who is my council member? Do you know who the council member is? Well, it's on the screen, so sorry. But so in a community board, you don't actually have to live in the area. So either you live there, you go to school there, you work there, or you have some other interest. You don't actually have to be in the community. You don't have to apply in a community board where you live. It can be for other reasons that you have a vested interest in that community board. But also, right, I don't know, I have a complaint, I want to raise a policy issue, I want to get funding for some project to be registered nonprofit with the city, but then you should be calling your council members. So in District 7, which is where Columbia is, that may not be where you live, the council member is Sean Abreu, and there's a little widget on the website, and you can go in and type your address or something nearby if you don't want to put in your actual address, and it will tell you who your council member is. And, probably other things, but I won't get into it. So where can you engage, right? You're an individual and you want to get involved. So the community boards are great places to engage, to start to see what goes on in a community. What does it look like? What's the conversation? But community boards are also, there's been a long history of them not being representative of their communities because certain people have more time, effort, energy, flexibility to join their community boards. So there has been a big push to get more people onto community boards. I think you can be on your community board starting at 16. So you don't actually have to be of voting age. And the more representation, obviously, the better. There are borough boards, they hold meetings. There are public committees through, just listen to a whole talk from the public advocate. The Department of Education, I think you have to be a parent, but there are community, not just PTOs, but there are like ways to give feedback to the schools. New York City Parks, Health and Hospitals, NYC Boats all have ways to engage or meetings you can attend. In general, like I said, public hearings are public. So you go onto the City Council website and you see if there's going to be an actual meeting and you're allowed to go. You just have to kind of show up at the time and you'll go through the metal detectors, but you are allowed to go to public meetings and sit in City Hall, rallies. So often nonprofits trying to pass legislation will hold rallies to get media attention and support. There's nonprofits, as we mentioned, there's participatory budgeting. So if you are, I don't know if you just have to live there actually, or you have to be registered to vote, but in your district, if your council member has decided to use some of their discretionary funds toward participatory budgeting, so they take some of their funds and they open it up and say, what are the projects you guys want to do? And then the community can vote on them, 11 and up, I believe, can vote and can organize and get involved. And, a lot of it winds up being requests for public restrooms. That's a major policy issue in New York City. But there's lots of other, it's not so much money that you can really revamp a neighborhood or large pieces of a neighborhood, but it's also enough money that it can seed ideas of projects that should be replicated. And it's also a good way to work with city agencies who often implement the actual projects. There's also, it's coming up soon, I don't know the exact date, there's Open Data Week. So there'll be a series of talks where there's people are encouraged to go to Open Data, which you can look up, and download data sets and visualize them in interesting and useful ways. The city, the story as I know it, and I'm not 100% sure on it, so you might want to look it up, is basically Bloomberg didn't want to make stuff public, right? Administrations, for whatever reason, withhold data. And Gail Brewer, who was the Manhattan Borough president at the time, said, no, no, no. And they passed a law that said you need to put out your data sets, but open data still has a collection of not super relevant data, and some of like the city can withhold certain data sets for certain reasons, but some of the data sets that you really want are harder to find and are in formats that are unusable. So it's a process, and more data sets come in all the time. Take a quick break. For the 5 boroughs, there are 5 flags, just a little bit of a stopping point for the moment. The Manhattan flag looks very close to the city flag. The Bronx flag, the newest flag was Staten Island, I think, because the other boroughs had a flag and like they didn't. Give myself a pause. You can read a little bit more about the seal of New York, but the orange is from the Dutch. And sorry, I'm just, I don't know, there may need to be a like eventual reboot of the flag because of the imaging on it. I think is maybe not the like most representative of the city today, but you'll probably see some of the Yankees colors, the Mets colors in here, all of our origins. So New York State, I'm not going to go into New York State partially and mostly because I don't understand that much about New York State, and most people in New York City, in fact, don't. It was one of the biggest questions we got when we spoke to candidates running for the 2021 elections. And we gave a series of talks to women. It was a group called 21 and 21 that were trying to promote the majority female city council. I was like, how does this work? And I was like, no clue. There's a complex interplay, right? New York City in some ways is its own zone within New York State. So laws that will get passed statewide don't necessarily always apply to New York City. And the reasons and how and what, I think, are, you know, totally different talk for another day. But just know that New York State is there, and New York City is kind of an oddity as having such a large city government compared to other states in some ways. There's a lot of other stuff I left out. We didn't talk about the budget. That's always important to know. Like, don't call the council at the end of June because they're finishing the budget. And after that, they're on vacation. How we pass legislation, it's similar to like how Congress passes legislation, but since we don't have a Senate and the council, it's a little bit different. History and politics matter more than you can ever imagine in New York City. And walking into a situation where you don't know its history can often put you at a disadvantage in being effective. And so if you really want to get immersed into politics and policy here, learning, you know, there's New York Historical Society, there are Manhattan, there are borough historians, and all the positions are filled right now, but there are definitely places to find that information. The more you know, the better. Last thing I'll say, in case you ever notice it, Excelsior is the motto of New York State. And I know that because I said it once to a city council member, and he was like, you know, that's the state flag, right? I was like, okay, that was like a cute joke. But anyway, on to part 2. So are we good? Okay, so I'll let it play for a second.
I don't think we have audio on our end for the video. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Say it again.
Hey, Nancy.
I think you have to optimize the sharing to share a video. There's a check mark that you can check when you're sharing the screen.
Okay, sorry, it's just like I have a few screens. So I don't have, I'm not sure. It says your screen sharing. Do you not see it when it's? Well, anyway, were we able to hear the audio for it? Okay, well, it's okay. I will say, I can just tell it to you. So Chuck is a comedian. He works in Star Trek Radio with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he spoke at our God, it was before the pandemic, so everything seems so confusing now. Anyway, we held a workshop slightly before the pandemic shutdowns at NYU, and he talks about like why science, and when science informs policy, you get good policy. I'm not so sure. I think he said it very well, but I think in my mind, and we're sort of trying to set the stage, right, for why science for New York and why science I think somehow we can't really call it policy, science, but I think that there has to be a switch, right? You're headed into their space. You don't want a policymaker coming to the lab and doing your experiment or telling you how to run science. And it's true in reverse, right? So if you really want to get involved in science policy, kind of have to start to look at like, where is the policymaker coming from? So I think there are aspects of science should inform policy and more scientists should be at the table, but you have to put it into context. And I think if we made policy only based on science, we wouldn't make very great policy either. So anyway, that was kind of the point I was trying to relay here, and videos always kind of cost a lot of time, so I don't want to sort of go off too much. So I'm having a hard time advancing it. Okay. Can you still see now the next slides? It says the screen sharing is paused. Resume share. Is that right? Can you see existing opportunities? Okay, great. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, that's what I think. I think I just missed something out of, I think I switched the slides out of order. Let me do this. Why science for New York? So what I wanted to do, or try to do, or I'm still working on, is to bring policymakers, scientists, and communities in NYC closer together to address challenges to the mutual benefit of all groups and the city as a whole. And the how is through project-based interaction, or sometimes typically called experiential learning, right? So no offense, but let's not sit in lectures. Let's not discuss the bigger ideals. Let's get to projects and figure out how to kind of keep moving people together and keep working toward bringing these communities that sometimes don't interact together. There's a big caveat here, right? There's a lot of, New York City has a lot of technical expertise. I think people don't think about it when they see how the city is designed, but maintaining the bridges, maintaining the roadways, designing the layouts, building the Lower East Side coastal resiliency, like we're literally lifting the island up from climate change, all of the science that went in during the pandemic. There are a lot of scientists. So what I'm really talking about in time is the subset of people who sit in academic institutions who don't quite have a pathway toward dealing with policymakers. And there's a decent number of them. There's expertise, I think, that is not being utilized and engaged in ways that it could and should and would benefit all parties. And so, you know, if a scientist wants to work with the city government, there's not really a pathway. That said, there are pathways in a lot of other programs. And SIPA is an example in the Public Policy School for Columbia. Oftentimes, a lot of programs have what's called capstone classes, where they have a class where they do these kinds of projects. They get guidance, they get resume experience, and the city gets some free consulting support. So kind of have to put all in context, but there are a lot of scientists working for New York City, and if you want to be one of them, that would be great. I'd probably read some of the articles on why a lot of people have left working for New York City right now before you go down that path, but say lovey. Yeah, sorry, I took this a little bit out of order. I think I just changed a slide this morning. Anyway, existing opportunities. So for right now, some of the fellowships, just so you have them on your radar, and I think some of you have heard about them. There's the Empire Fellowship at the state level, which deals with the executive branch for the state. There is the State Senate Fellowship, deadline April 30th. The Eagleton Fellowship in New Jersey, if you're interested in maybe getting out of some of the hugely expensive housing in New York City and coming to neighboring New Jersey. If you deal with any issues in waste management, there's an EREF scholarship, a very close deadline. And there's probably a lot more like that. I've never really made a complete list of all the fellowships. The idea is, I think from Science for New York, I personally would like it to be more like capstone classes, where scientists are able to get training as part of their day job, and we're not all scrounging around in the limited hours we have left to try to do something beneficial to a city that already has a lot of expertise on staff. But maybe another conversation for another day. So maybe we'll go back to the chat for a minute, so I don't just talk the whole time. I say science policy issues in New York City. what do you think of? Like, what comes to your mind? What do we even, you know, it's a term we throw around a lot, but what are we talking about? You can just put some, whatever issue comes to your mind, maybe just throw something in the chat. Yep, storm surge is a huge one. So yeah, storm surge. Anything else? There's got to be more issues that come to mind. There's like a bazillion issues. Waste management. Yeah, that's a super, I mean, okay, well, we won't spend more time if you want to add more, but yeah, I always kind of jokingly say it's a city of lead, mold, and garbage, and it's not so joking in that those are some of the major issues in New York City, and rodents. I mean, that's been a big topic lately. But I basically tried someday, and I wrote this down when we gave other talks for like, it might not be that easy to see, so I apologize. There's a bazillion issues, basically. STEM, transport, environmental issues, climate change, resiliency, people touched on, public health. You have to kind of define at some point what is a science policy issue, or at least how are you using that term, so it's not sort of anything and everything, but it's also not so narrow that it can't be flexible. So at the start of the pandemic, a lot of graduate students were home from their labs without much to do. And we decided, we had seen all these cool maps. There's maps for everything. There's a tree census. There's anything you can imagine. You can actually go if you want on the tree census and see, like, has your tree been watered on its block? Is it due for maintenance? Is it due for pruning? There's just lots and lots of maps about New York City. We wanted one. So we said, can we make a map of New York City's science policy issues? And we had to come up with some kind of methodology to do it, right? So is it an issue directly about STEM? So whether it was STEM access or things like that, climate change falls in that to me. Are there aspects related to STEM but not directly connected? So like housing has many issues of lead and mold, but it's also sort of complicated, right? Because it's on the border with housing issues and affordability and general state of repair. And then there's everything else, right? And I think every issue in some way can benefit from someone who can look at it logically and kind of according to the scientific method and see, you know, is there more data? Is there more information out there? So we basically went through a bunch of sources. You couldn't use them all. There's just tons of them. We defined a plan. We had everyone take at least a borough, but some people took just a few, you know, Queens and Brooklyn are pretty big, so I think we split them up between two people. And at a certain point, you have to rely on expert judgment, right? You have to say, like, is this a science policy issue or not? Is this the most important issue in this district? And, you know, there's many ways to do this, right? We could look at data. We could ask communities. We don't have the bandwidth to do that. We could ask policymakers. These relied heavily on the community district profile, so community boards write to the city and they tell them what they think their main issues are. We combined that with other data and we made this map. It's a little bit out of date now, but I think it sort of generally holds true, where we said, okay, to make an image that could resonate with people, we still had to just pick one issue per community board district, and most of the city's data is by community board district, not by council district. This kind of got us a lot of attention. So this was like the first op-ed we ever put out. It's in the Gotham Gazette if you want to read it, and we called it Rebuilding a Stronger, Healthier New York Through Science. And this was the time when everyone was talking about rebuilding from the pandemic. You know, and it's all with a grain of salt, right? Like things like park access, they mean different things in different places, and we couldn't communicate all of that in one 1D slide. You know, it could be you can't get to the park, but you have a very big park, which happens in the Bronx within Cortlandt. It could be you just don't have any parks. So, you know, it depends to some degree. But the comptroller's office actually reached out to us, and the Staten Island Borough president reached out to us, the former one. We had a nice chat with him. Didn't really go anywhere, but he works for the city now. But like I said, we put out this op-ed and there was attention on that, but it also caught the attention of someone I worked with who now no longer works for the city, who created this climate knowledge exchange, excuse me, and wanted to use it in their report. So we wound up partnering on a climate change report with the city. If you're interested, you can look up that report, but I won't go into it in too much detail. And we also got involved as a result with the climate knowledge exchange process. So we got involved in interacting with communities and other city agencies about how to make the whole process of climate change and related efforts work a little bit more smoothly, and how to get community involvement in research priorities. So usually the city sort of top down sets the research priorities. Could we eventually find a process where communities were helping to set the city's research agenda? So it's kind of interesting. It's still going, but I think it's fallen off a little bit. And then we sort of, like one thing begets another kind of thing. We would love, we've never fully gotten there, to take all of that data and not make a one-dimensional map, basically, but one that you could hover over. And, is climate change and housing, how are they, like, are the same districts that are flooding also showing lead problems, rodent problems? Like, can we layer all the science policy issues in so that you could walk through a map and tell a council member, this is the, housing's a problem, but it's actually not all housing. It's housing in this area, or this specific, it's roaches, or whatever it is. Could we find a way to communicate that wasn't so taxing and difficult with the way that the city's data sets are? We got pretty far down that path, and we presented it. Well, someone from a graduate student actually from Mount Sinai did a lot of this work at Open Data Week for 2022. And in that process, because we wanted to overlay with climate variables, we got completely stuck on the city's heat data. So there's a heat, NASA satellite data sort of converted to heat distribution for the summer in New York City. But we could never download the data from the city council website, and it was out of date anyway. So this kind of turned into its own mini expedition where I had to call a friend that was in my graduate group who now works for NASA. He had to call in some data analytics people that he knew to get the data mapped. And we wound up being able to update the city's heat data, like I said, from satellites. And I mean, it was a lot of transformations, and it was like, I know that it's not magic, and yet after all the work, it was like really nice to see that it like pretty much meets all the intuitive check marks I would have to see to be like, it's right. You can see, right, there's areas of the coast, all of the big parks are coming up as cool. All of the hottest spots we know, right? Like JFK is on stock concrete, LaGuardia is on stock concrete. There's some warehouses in Brooklyn. And then we did a little more research and spoke to the city about it, because there are pilots now for cool pavement to basically paint the town white. And could that work in New York City? And then, like I said, we spoke to DOT a little, who's kind of going down that path. There's always complexities here, right? Like, so Phoenix is painting its sidewalks and roadways, LA is doing it. New York's a little different because of the density. So once you start bouncing heat around, it goes somewhere, and it usually goes into buildings. And once you start painting pavement, it's like plastic, it becomes unusable for future applications. And the city actually does a lot to make sure asphalt doesn't wind up in landfills. But anyway, we put out this piece on it if you're interested in reading it. One of the big things we've been involved with for a while now is making climate snapshots. So this started with candidates in 2021, and I actually just finally met one of them this weekend. I went out to Rockaway to meet her in person after the whole pandemic. They basically came up to us and said, like, if we're running a campaign and people are asking us about climate change, how do we think about climate change in our district? And we went through a variety of sources, and we basically tried to put them all together into one document, and then ultimately into one summary statement. So this is a small bit for what we did for Council District 7. And it connected us to another council member in Brooklyn, who we've since used it to help their participatory budgeting efforts. What I think it really does is people, even for me, who knows a lot about climate change, if you try to ask me what's going on in your neighborhood and have one cohesive conversation about it, it is very difficult. So people mean well, they know parts of the story, but it's hard without any framing to have a conversation. And in climate change, a lot of times it's like, we want a playground, and it's flooding. Well, if we build asphalt and it floods, we're doing two contradictory things. And so it's a way of having conversations and hopefully having them be more productive. And we wrote another op-ed about that because we knew how to write op-eds and they're not very hard to write. You can see this one here. But really, like, if you're just a person who cares about this issue and you don't have a data analytics background, you don't have a scientific background, and even for us, it's kind of torture to go through all the city's sources. Some are in PDFs, some aren't, some are in databases, some aren't. It's hard, right? It's not that accessible. And if you have the time, great. I'm assuming most people don't have the time. And, you know, if you're in an underserved community and you're working two jobs, when are you gonna have the time to do this kind of thing? And then incomplete information, which I think is often what happens, can lead to undesired outcomes. And you go through what happened with the Lower East Side coastal resiliency. There were reasonable concerns about losses of green space, but it caused a big delay to building or starting construction of the seawall on the Lower East Side that the whole area was badly damaged from Sandy. And it got bad. I mean, the meetings I was at one meeting, people were like screaming at each other. But it's always like you're making decisions that aren't helping you, but you don't have the full picture in a way, and it doesn't always lead to like a really productive conversation. That said, there's a lot of issues at play in New York City. And I think community level input can improve both local and city level responses. But it's hard asking communities is a great idea, but if the communities aren't particularly well informed, the conversations don't really benefit anyone. We got a lot involved in organics recycling. So that's just a term for saying natural composting and machine assisted composting. We wrote a report on the environmental and economic benefits of organic waste recycling from horses with the NYPD. We wrote a series of FAQs because we were just so confused about what was going on in New York City, and we tried to make sense of it, and 10 pages turned into 33. And now the Department of Sanitation is asking me for help related to them. And we wrote another op-ed about thinking outside the composting box and using more equipment that's come online in recent years to maybe help address it. The last thing in this section, and maybe I've just gone over time, so I won't do the end, but we had this fun project with Parsons School of Design to kind of create new ways to communicate some of these science policy issues. And we made food waste posters for each borough. I'm from the Bronx, so I showed the Bronx. And here is me and the artist and my daughter in Manhattan looking at the pictures actually on Link NYC. And if you're interested, I can show you the other posters. So I've talked for a bit. This is the last section. Do you want me to go on, or do you want me to cut it here and just take questions?
So Nancy, I think we have gone over time. So most of our participants have had to for some meetings. If anyone here, has some time for questions, if you'd like to ask them, you're welcome to. Nancy, if you have time for a couple questions, but yeah, we started a little late, which is on us, and some planning here, but yes, let's pause here. And if there's any questions in the room, please come over and ask them. Do you want to take the stand?
Just a simple question. How can we get in contact with you?
Sure, I will skip to that slide. Sorry. Yeah.
Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, Nancy, I have another quick question, which is, if you go back to the slide where you made the first map of the policy issues in the city.
Yeah, oh, you can ask and I'll find it.
No, I was going to say, like, I saw, so I had two questions about it. The first one was,
It's really hard to hear. I don't know if you can get closer to the mic. Sorry.
Is this better?
Slightly.
Hold on one second. We'll try to change the audio.
Sure.
How's this?
Yes, that's great. It was great for 1 second. Now I can hear nothing again. Sorry.
How's this? Okay, so
Yeah.
like, if you look like at the health outcomes, you know, just as an example, like you have 3 districts listed there. I was just curious, like what kind of things, like what made you actually list a particular district under a, you know, particular heading? Like what types of issues, you know, like, I guess, how did you find out, you know, or decide like this is an issue in this district? And then the second part of the question is, what do you think is the best way to use like the information in this map?
Yeah, so, you know, there's no, like I said, there's no perfect way to do this. So we partially did the ranking. So we had to at least prioritize, was it a science issue to some degree? And then we had to kind of see how many times it was coming up. So the community board district profiles rank the issues. So we had to kind of take their rankings. We had to look at other reports. So there's community health profiles, there's environmental profiles. We kind of had to like make a spreadsheet, organize them all, and sort of effectively cross them over and say, okay, it keeps coming up, keeps coming up. And then someone looked at it as a human being and said, yes, this seems to be the topic. What's interesting, actually, and I can't show it here, there's another version of this map. Underserved communities, it was much harder to pick one issue. There always seemed to be a series of issues and they seem to overlap. Sanitation issues came up, health access came up. So it seems like, and you don't want to say it in the negative, right? Underserved communities likely could benefit more from people who could come in and try to help figure these things out, or at least lend more expertise, because there was more issues that seemed to be hard to pick a single one. What can you do with this? So it's kind of skip so I don't go too long. There's lots of stuff, right? This is a great conversation starter in and of itself, right? Anything that's visual, anything that maps out the city, it's a great way to introduce yourself. It's also a great way to inform yourself. So you kind of got to think on all sides, right? A policymaker can use this in conversations. I can use this to walk into a district and say, oh, this is probably what's going on here. Like in Manhattan Community Board District 5, I mentioned it and they were like, yeah, that we experienced that. So it's kind of a starting point for conversation. I think it would be a great tool for policymakers if we could ever build out all the layers to it, but it lends a lot of, it's sort of like a jumping off point that creates a lot of other directions and conversations, but without it, you're just sort of talking to them. And it, you know, it's easy when everyone's holding a piece of paper and talking about something.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, do we have any questions from our audience online? I know most people probably have to go at this point, but just in case anyone has some burning questions left. No. Okay. Well, all right, if there's no more questions in the chat, Nancy, thank you so much for chatting with us today. It is a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have your perspective and your experience. And so thank you for taking the time to make this presentation and come talk to us today.
Sure. Nice meeting everyone. Thank you.